Detective Ray Wilson had been working the Beverly Hills beat for 15 years. He'd seen everything from celebrity scandals to high-profile robberies. Today started like any other Tuesday afternoon. The sun was shining bright over the fancy shopping district, and people were going about their business as usual. Ray was driving his patrol car down Rodeo Drive when the radio crackled to life. Unit 247, we have reports of suspicious activity at the Beverly Center. Young person loitering, possible shoplifting suspect. Ray sighed and grabbed his radio. Unit 247 responding, he said, already feeling annoyed. These calls were usually nothing. Rich people calling the police because they didn't like seeing teenagers hanging around their expensive stores. He pulled into the Beverly Center parking lot and looked around. The place was busy with shoppers carrying designer bags and tourists taking photos. Then he spotted her. A teenage girl sitting alone on a bench outside a coffee shop. She was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, nothing fancy. Her long dark hair fell over her shoulders as she looked down at her phone. Ray parked his car and got out. The girl looked up when she heard the car door slam. She seemed calm, maybe a little curious about why a police officer was walking toward her. Ray had already made up his mind that this was probably going to be a waste of time, but he had to check it out anyway. "Excuse me," Ray called out as he approached the bench. "I need to speak with you." The girl looked up from her phone. "Yes, officer? Is everything okay?" Ray studied her face. She looked young, maybe 16 or 17. Her voice was polite and respectful. But something about the situation bothered him. What was a teenager doing here alone? Why wasn't she in school? These thoughts ran through his mind as he pulled out his notepad. "I got a call about someone causing trouble around here," Ray said, looking down at the girl. "You been here long?" "About 20 minutes," the girl replied, still sitting on the bench. "I'm just waiting for my ride. My dad is picking me up after his meeting." Ray wrote something in his notepad. He noticed the girl's phone was expensive, probably the latest model. Her sneakers looked new too. But that didn't mean anything. Kids these days had all sorts of gadgets, even if their families couldn't really afford them. "What's your name?" Ray asked. "Arissa," the girl said. "Arissa LeBrock Seagal." Ray wrote down the name but didn't recognize it. The last name sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. "You got some ID on you?" Arissa reached into her small backpack. "I have my student ID," she said, pulling out a card from Beverly Hills High School. "I don't have my driver's license yet. I'm only 16. Ray looked at the student ID. Everything seemed normal. But he was still suspicious. Rich kids from Beverly Hills didn't usually hang out alone at shopping centers. They had drivers or went places with friends. Something felt off about the whole situation. "So what are you really doing here?" Ray asked, his tone becoming more serious. "And don't tell me you're just waiting for your dad. Kids your age are usually up to something." Arissa's expression changed slightly. She looked confused by the officer's attitude. "I'm really just waiting for my father," she said again. "He's in a business meeting nearby. He should be here in about 10 minutes, Ray didn't believe her. In his experience, teenagers always had some story ready when they got caught doing something wrong. He'd heard every excuse in the book over his 15 years on the force. The respectful attitude was probably just an act. "Stand up," Ray ordered. "I need to search your bag." Arissa hesitated for a moment. "Why?" "I haven't done anything wrong." "Don't argue with me," Ray said, his voice getting louder. "When a police officer tells you to do something, you do it. Now stand up." Several people walking by started to notice the interaction. A woman with shopping bags slowed down to watch. An older man sitting at a nearby table put down his coffee and turned to look. Ray noticed the attention but didn't care. He was focused on the girl who was slowly standing up from the bench. "This is my backpack," Arissa said, holding up a small black bag. "There's nothing in it except my phone charger, some gum, and my water bottle." Ray took the backpack and started going through it. Just like the girl said, there wasn't much inside, but he continued searching anyway, checking every pocket and compartment. The small crowd of onlookers was growing bigger. "Officer," said a voice from behind him. Ray turned around to see a middle-aged woman with concerned eyes. "Is everything all right here?" "This girl hasn't done anything wrong. She's been sitting there quietly the whole time I've been shopping." "Ma'am, I need you to move along," Ray said firmly. "This is police business." "But she's just a child," the woman insisted. "She's been very polite and hasn't bothered anyone." Ray felt his anger rising. He didn't like being questioned by civilians, especially when he was doing his job. "I said move along now." The woman reluctantly walked away, but Ray could see her taking out her phone. Great, he thought. Now people are going to start recording. He turned back to Arissa, who was standing quietly with her hands at her sides. You know what I think? Ray said, stepping closer to the girl. I think you're lying to me. I think you're here causing trouble and now you're trying to play innocent. Sir, I promise I'm telling the truth, Arissa said. Her voice was still calm, but Ray could see a hint of worry in her eyes. My father really is coming to pick me up. You can call the school if you want to verify who I am. Oh, I'm going to do a lot more than that, Ray said. He was becoming more convinced that something was wrong with the girl's story. In his mind, innocent people didn't stay this calm when questioned by police. They got nervous, they stammered, they showed emotion. This girl was too composed. Ray pulled out his radio and called for a background check on the name Arissa Seagal. While he waited for a response, he continued questioning her. Where exactly is your father's meeting? What kind of business is he in? Why didn't he drop you off at home first? Arissa answered each question patiently. Her father was a consultant, she explained. The meeting was at an office building 2 blocks away. She had come along because they were planning to go shopping together afterward. Her answers sounded reasonable, but Ray remained skeptical. The radio crackled with the background check results. Clean record, no warrants, address in Beverly Hills matched what the girl had told him. But Ray wasn't satisfied. Something still felt wrong about the whole situation. As he was deciding what to do next, his phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor. Keep community relations positive. Be careful with interactions involving minors. Ray glanced at the message and felt annoyed. Everyone was so worried about being politically correct these days. He looked back at Arissa, who was still standing patiently beside the bench. The crowd of onlookers had grown to about a dozen people. Some were openly staring, while others were pretending to shop while keeping an eye on the situation. Ray made his decision. If this girl thought she could outsmart him with her polite act, she was wrong. He'd been doing this job long enough to know when someone was hiding something. And he was going to find out what it was, no matter what it took. Little did he know that his next decisions would change his life forever. Ray Wilson stared at Arissa for a long moment, trying to read her face. The background check had come back clean, but his gut told him something was still off. He'd learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now they were telling him this girl was hiding something. You know what I don't understand? Ray said, circling around the bench where Arissa had been sitting. Why would your father let his 16-year-old daughter wait alone in a busy shopping center? That doesn't sound very responsible to me. Arissa watched him carefully. My father trusts me to take care of myself. I've been taking self-defense classes since I was little. Plus, this is a safe area with lots of people around. Ray stopped walking and faced her directly. Self-defense classes, huh? What kind? Mixed martial arts, Arissa replied. My father wanted me to be able to protect myself. This information made Ray even more suspicious. In his experience, kids who knew how to fight were often the ones looking for trouble. He'd dealt with plenty of teenagers who thought they were tough because they watched some karate movies or took a few classes at the local gym. So you think you're some kind of tough guy? Ray asked, his tone becoming more aggressive. Think you can handle yourself in any situation? No, sir, Arissa said quietly. The training is for self-defense only. My instructors always taught us to avoid fights whenever possible. Ray laughed sarcastically. Right. And I'm sure you've never used those skills to intimidate other kids or cause problems at school. I would never do that, Arissa said. And for the first time, Ray could hear some emotion creeping into her voice. Violence should only be used as a last resort to protect yourself or others. The growing crowd of onlookers was making Ray feel pressured. He could see people whispering to each other and pointing in his direction. Some had their phones out, probably recording the whole interaction. This was exactly the kind of situation his supervisors had warned him about. But he couldn't back down now. If he let this girl go without a thorough investigation, and she turned out to be involved in something criminal, it would reflect badly on his record. I need you to put your hands behind your back, Ray said suddenly. Arissa looked shocked. Why? What did I do wrong? You're being detained for questioning, Ray said, reaching for his handcuffs. Your story doesn't add up, and I think you're lying to me about why you're here. Officer, please, Arissa said, taking a small step backward. I've answered all your questions honestly. I haven't broken any laws. I'm just waiting for my father. Don't move, Ray shouted much louder than necessary. Several people in the crowd jumped at the sudden volume. "Put your hands behind your back right now." Arisa's hands were shaking slightly, but she complied with the order. Ray could see that she was finally showing some fear, which in his mind confirmed that she had something to hide. Innocent people might be nervous around police, but they usually cooperated fully. This girl had been too calm from the beginning. As Ray approached with the handcuffs, Arisa spoke again.
"Can I please call my father?"
"He's probably wondering where I am." "You'll get your phone call later," Ray said, grabbing her wrist, "after we figure out what you're really doing here." But as Ray tried to put the handcuffs on, something unexpected happened. Arisa's wrist slipped out of his grip with a smooth, practiced motion. It wasn't aggressive or violent, just a simple defensive technique that created distance between them. Ray was caught off guard by the move. "Don't try to resist," Ray yelled, lunging forward to grab her again. This time, Arisa used a different technique. When Ray reached for her, she stepped to the side and gently redirected his momentum, causing him to stumble slightly. Again, it wasn't an attack, just a way to avoid being grabbed. But to Ray, it felt like he was being made to look foolish in front of all these people. "She's resisting arrest," Ray shouted to the crowd as if he needed to justify what was happening. "Everyone saw that." "No, she's not," called out a man from the crowd. "She's just trying to get away from you. You haven't even told her what she's being arrested for." Ray's face was getting red with anger and embarrassment. He'd been a police officer for 15 years, and he wasn't about to let a teenager make him look incompetent. He reached for his radio to call for backup. "Unit 247 requesting immediate assistance at Beverly Center," he said into the radio. "I have a suspect resisting arrest in a hostile crowd gathering." "Ray, what's your situation?" came the voice of his supervisor. "Sergeant Peters, juvenile suspect, possible theft, now resisting arrest and using some kind of martial arts moves," Ray replied, breathing heavily. Arisa was standing about 10 feet away from him now, her hands visible and raised slightly to show she wasn't holding any weapons. Her face showed a mixture of fear and confusion. She clearly didn't understand how the situation had escalated so quickly. "Sir," Arisa said, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't want any trouble. I just want to wait for my father. Please, can we just call him and clear this up?" But Ray was beyond reasoning now. In his mind, this girl had disrespected his authority and made him look bad in front of a crowd of people. Some of those people were now openly criticizing his actions, and he could hear phones buzzing as people shared videos and photos on social media. "You should have thought about that before you decided to fight with a police officer," Ray said angrily. "Now you're going to face the consequences." An older woman in the crowd stepped forward. She was well-dressed and looked like she had some authority. "Officer, I've been watching this whole interaction, and this young lady has been nothing but polite and cooperative. She answered all your questions, showed you her ID, and let you search her bag. She hasn't done anything wrong." "Ma'am, I need you to step back," Ray said. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," the woman replied. "We're all citizens here, and we have a right to witness what our police officers are doing. This girl is clearly scared and confused. Why don't you just call her father like she asked?" More people in the crowd began voicing their support for the woman's suggestion. Ray could feel the situation slipping out of his control. The last thing he needed was for this to turn into some kind of public relations nightmare. But he'd already committed to this course of action, and backing down now would make him look weak. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately," Ray shouted. "This is an active police investigation." But instead of dispersing, more people seemed to be gathering. Word was spreading through the shopping center that something was happening, and curious onlookers were coming to see what was going on. Ray could hear sirens in the distance, which meant his backup was on the way. At least then he'd have some support in dealing with this crowd. Arisa remained where she was, about 10 feet from Ray, with her hands still raised. She looked young and scared. Nothing like the defiant criminal Ray was trying to make her out to be. But in his mind, he'd gone too far to turn back now. He was convinced that once his backup arrived and they conducted a proper investigation, they'd find evidence that this girl was up to no good. What Ray didn't know was that among the crowd of onlookers, several people had already posted videos of the interaction on social media. The hashtag #Dar Beverly Hills incident was beginning to trend, and local news stations were starting to take notice. Within the hour, this routine police call would become something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. As the sirens got louder, Ray felt confident that reinforcements would help him maintain control of the situation. He had no idea that his next few decisions would not only end his career, but also spark a national conversation about police conduct and the treatment of young people by law enforcement officers. The sound of sirens filled the air as 3 police cars pulled into the Beverly Center parking lot. Ray felt a wave of relief wash over him. Finally, he would have the backup he needed to handle this situation properly. The crowd had grown to about 30 people, and many of them were openly filming with their phones. He knew that having other officers present would help restore order. Officer Jake Martinez was the first to get out of his patrol car. He was younger than Ray, with only 5 years on the force, but he had a reputation for being level-headed in difficult situations. As he approached, he could immediately see the tension in the air. "What's the situation, Ray?" Jake asked, looking between the officer and the teenage girl who was standing several feet away with her hands raised. "Juvenile suspect. Initially called in for suspicious behavior," Ray explained quickly. "She gave me a false story about waiting for her father, then resisted when I tried to detain her. Used some kind of martial arts moves to avoid arrest." Jake looked at Arissa, who appeared calm but clearly frightened. She didn't look like the typical troublemaker he was used to dealing with. Her clothes were neat and clean, her posture was respectful, and she wasn't showing any signs of aggression or defiance. "Miss," Jake said gently, "can you tell me your name?" "Arissa LeBrock Seagal," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I already showed Officer Wilson my student ID from Beverly Hills High School." Jake turned to Ray. "Did you run the background check?" "Clean record," Ray admitted reluctantly. "But that doesn't mean anything. She's lying about why she's here." 2 more officers had joined them now, Officer Lisa Chen and Sergeant Tom Peters, Ray's direct supervisor. Peters looked around at the crowd and the multiple phones recording the scene. This was exactly the kind of situation the department had been trying to avoid lately. "All right, everyone step back and give us some room to work," Peters announced to the crowd. Most people complied, but they didn't leave entirely. They formed a larger circle, still close enough to see and hear what was happening. Peters approached Arissa. "Young lady, I need you to know that you're not under arrest at this time. We just need to clear up some confusion about why you're here."
"Can you explain to me what happened?"
Arissa took a deep breath. "I came here with my father about an hour ago. He had a business meeting at the office building 2 blocks from here. I decided to wait at the coffee shop and do some shopping while he was in his meeting. Officer Wilson approached me and started asking questions, which I answered honestly. Then he wanted to search my bag, which I allowed. After that, he tried to handcuff me even though I hadn't done anything wrong." "And when he tried to handcuff you?" Peters asked. "I used defensive moves that my instructors taught me," Arissa explained. "Not to hurt him, just to create distance. I've been training in mixed martial arts since I was 8 years old. My father always taught me that if someone tries to grab you and you feel threatened, you should create space and look for help." Peters nodded. This explanation made sense to him. The girl seemed articulate and truthful, and her story was consistent. But he could see that Ray was getting more agitated by the minute. "Sarge, she's playing games with us," Ray interrupted. "Look at how calm she is. Innocent kids get scared and emotional when they're questioned by police. She's too composed. And those martial arts moves? She knew exactly what she was doing. Maybe because she was raised to stay calm in stressful situations," suggested Officer Chen. "Some parents teach their kids to be respectful and cooperative with authority figures." Ray felt like his fellow officers were turning against him. "You weren't here for the whole interaction. This girl has been disrespectful from the beginning. She questioned my authority and refused to follow simple orders." From the crowd, several voices called out in disagreement. "That's not true," shouted the well-dressed woman who had spoken up earlier. "She was polite the whole time," added another voice. "We all saw what really happened." Peters held up his hand to quiet the crowd. He was trying to get a clear picture of what had actually occurred, but with so many people talking at once, it was difficult to sort out the facts. "Miss LeBrock Seagal," Peters said, "can you call your father now so we can verify your story?" "Yes, thank you," Arissa said gratefully. She reached slowly into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "Should I put it on speaker so you can hear?" "That would be helpful," Peters agreed, but Ray stepped forward aggressively. "Wait a minute. We can't just take her word for it that she's really calling her father. She could be calling anyone and asking them to lie for her." "Ray, calm down," Peters said firmly. "Let's just see who she calls." Arissa dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. It rang twice before a deep, distinctive voice answered, "Arissa, where are you? I've been looking for you at the coffee shop." "Dad, I'm still at the Beverly Center." "But there's been a misunderstanding with the police," Arissa explained, her voice showing some emotion for the first time. "Can you come over here? I'm near the main entrance by the fountain." "Police?" The man's voice immediately became more serious. "What's going on? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay, but they want to talk to you to verify who I am." "I'll be there in 2 minutes," the voice said. "Stay calm and do exactly what they tell you to do." Peters took the phone from Arissa. "Sir, this is Sergeant Peters with the Beverly Hills Police Department. Can you confirm your relationship to this young lady?" "She's my daughter," the voice replied. "Arissa LeBrock Seagal. I dropped her off at the Beverly Center about an hour ago, while I attended a business meeting nearby. We were planning to do some shopping together when I finished. And your name, sir?" "Steven Seagal." The name didn't register immediately with Peters, but Officer Chen's eyes widened slightly. She leaned over and whispered something to Martinez, who also looked surprised. "Mr. Seagal, we're going to need you to come down here and provide some identification," Peters said into the phone. "Of course. Like I said, I'll be there in 2 minutes." Peters ended the call and handed the phone back to Arissa. Ray was pacing back and forth, clearly frustrated that things weren't going the way he'd expected. "This doesn't change anything," Ray said loudly. "So what if her father is coming? That doesn't prove she wasn't up to something before he gets here." "Ray, what exactly do you think she was doing?" Peters asked, starting to lose patience with his subordinate. "I don't know yet, but my instincts are telling me something's not right about this whole situation." Officer Chen stepped closer to Peters. "Sarge, I think we need to be very careful here. If this is really Steven Seagal's daughter, this could become a big problem if we handle it wrong." "Who's Steven Seagal?" Ray asked, overhearing the conversation. Before anyone could answer, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot and drove straight toward them. The vehicle was large and imposing, with tinted windows and what looked like professional security features. It parked about 20 feet away from the group of officers. The driver's door opened and a tall, powerfully built man stepped out. He was wearing a dark suit and moved with the confident stride of someone used to being in control of situations. Even from a distance, his presence was commanding. As he walked toward them, people in the crowd began to recognize him. Whispers of, "Is that Steven Seagal?" and "Oh my God, it really is him," rippled through the gathering. Ray Wilson looked at the approaching man and felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Even if he didn't immediately recognize the name, he could tell by everyone's reaction that this was someone important. Someone with influence, someone who could make his life very difficult if this situation wasn't handled properly. But it was too late to back down now. Ray had already committed to his course of action, and changing his story at this point would make him look incompetent and dishonest. He decided he would have to see this through, regardless of who Arissa's father turned out to be. As Steven Seagal got closer, his eyes were focused entirely on his daughter, checking to make sure she was unharmed. But Ray could see the controlled anger in the man's expression, and he knew that the next few minutes were going to be the most challenging of his career. Steven Seagal approached the group of police officers with measured steps. At 6'4" and weighing over 200 pounds, his presence was impossible to ignore. He had the kind of physical presence that came from decades of martial arts training and action movie roles. But more than that, he carried himself with the authority of someone who had worked in law enforcement himself. "Arissa," he said softly as he reached his daughter. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad," she replied, though her voice showed the strain of the past hour. "Just confused about why this all happened." Steven looked around at the 4 police officers surrounding them. His eyes lingered on each face, reading their body language and assessing the situation. Years of training had taught him to quickly understand group dynamics and identify who was in charge. "Sergeant Peters?" he asked, looking at the officer with supervisor stripes on his uniform. "Yes, sir. You're Mr. Seagal?" "That's correct." Steven reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a driver's license and several other forms of identification. "I understand there's been some confusion about my daughter's presence here today." Peters examined the IDs carefully. Everything checked out. Steven Seagal, Beverly Hills address, everything matching what Arissa had told them. But Peters was also acutely aware that they now had a crowd of about 50 people watching their every move, many of them recording with their phones. Mr. Seagal, we responded to a call about suspicious activity, Peters explained. Officer Wilson here was investigating that call when he encountered your daughter. Stephen's eyes moved to Ray Wilson, who was standing slightly apart from the other officers. Ray looked uncomfortable and was avoiding direct eye contact. Stephen had dealt with enough law enforcement officers over the years to recognize when someone was in over their head. What kind of suspicious activity? Stephen asked calmly. Peters looked at Ray, expecting him to answer since he had been the responding officer. Ray cleared his throat nervously. Someone called in a report of a young person loitering and possible shoplifting, Ray said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. And based on that call, you decided my daughter was the suspect? Stephen asked. She matched the general description. Ray replied defensively. Stephen raised an eyebrow. What was the description? Ray hesitated. The truth was the call had been vague. Young person, dark clothing was about all the information they had received. Looking back on it now with Steven Seagal staring at him, Ray realized how thin his justification really was. The caller said it was a young person in dark clothing acting suspicious, Ray said. Stephen looked at his daughter, who was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. And you decided that matched Arissa? She was sitting alone, not shopping, just on her phone, Ray continued. It seemed suspicious to me. So being a teenager sitting on a bench using a phone is now suspicious behavior? Stephen asked, his tone remaining calm but with an edge that everyone present could hear. Officer Chen stepped forward. Mr. Seagal, I think there might have been a misunderstanding here. Your daughter was very cooperative throughout this interaction. She provided identification, allowed a search of her belongings, and answered all questions politely. Then why wasn't she released? Stephen asked. All eyes turned to Ray, who was beginning to sweat despite the cool afternoon air. He felt trapped between his original assessment of the situation and the reality that was now unfolding in front of him. She resisted when I tried to detain her, Ray said. Used martial arts moves to avoid being handcuffed. Stephen's expression didn't change, but those who knew him could see the anger building behind his eyes. My daughter used defensive techniques to avoid being improperly detained. Improperly detained? Ray shot back, his frustration boiling over. I was conducting a legitimate investigation based on a citizen complaint. Based on what crime? Stephen asked pointedly. What law did my daughter break that justified detaining her? The question hung in the air. Peters, Martinez, and Chen all looked at Ray, waiting for his answer. The crowd had grown even larger, and people were pressing closer to hear the conversation. Ray felt cornered. She was loitering, he said finally. On a public bench outside a business where she had made a purchase? Stephen replied, pulling a receipt from Arissa's hand. This shows she bought a coffee from that shop 25 minutes ago. How is that loitering? Peters examined the receipt. The timestamp clearly showed that Arissa had been a paying customer of the coffee shop. This significantly undermined Ray's justification for the initial contact. Furthermore, Stephen continued, I'd like to understand why a routine questioning turned into an attempt to handcuff a 16-year-old girl who had committed no crime, was carrying valid identification, and was fully cooperative. Officer Martinez stepped forward. Mr. Seagal, from what we can piece together, there seems to have been an escalation that wasn't necessary. I was doing my job. Ray interrupted angrily. This girl was being disrespectful and evasive. She wouldn't give me straight answers. I answered every question you asked, Arissa said quietly, speaking up for the first time since her father arrived. I told you my name, showed you my ID, let you search my bag, and explained exactly why I was here. Several people in the crowd voiced their agreement. She's right, called out the well-dressed woman who had been there from the beginning. I watched the whole thing. She was polite and cooperative the entire time. The young lady never raised her voice or showed any disrespect, added an elderly man who ran a nearby jewelry store. I came outside when I heard the commotion, and she was just standing there calmly answering questions. Ray looked around at the crowd, feeling more isolated by the minute. Even his fellow officers seemed to be questioning his version of events. He could see doubt in their faces, and he knew his credibility was slipping away. You weren't there for the beginning, Ray said desperately. You didn't see how she was acting before you all showed up. But his words rang hollow, and everyone present could sense it. Steven Seagal studied Ray's face for a long moment, reading the desperation and fear there. As someone who had worked as a reserve deputy sheriff for years, Stephen understood the pressures that police officers faced, but he also understood the difference between good police work and abuse of authority. "Officer Wilson," Stephen said calmly, "I think we both know that what happened here today was not good police work." Ray's face flushed red. "Are you questioning my professional judgment?" "I'm questioning your actions," Stephen replied. "And based on what I'm hearing from witnesses and my daughter, those actions were inappropriate." Sergeant Peters could see the situation spiraling out of control. Ray was becoming increasingly defensive, the crowd was getting larger and more vocal, and they now had a celebrity father whose daughter had potentially been mistreated by one of his officers. "Mr. Seagal," Peters said diplomatically, "I think we can resolve this situation without any formal complaints. Your daughter is free to go and we apologize for any inconvenience." But Stephen wasn't ready to let it go that easily. "Sergeant, with all due respect, this isn't just about inconvenience. This is about a pattern of behavior that led to my daughter being targeted, questioned without cause, and physically threatened for no reason other than sitting on a public bench." The weight of Stephen's words settled over the group. Peters knew he was right. Looking at the situation objectively, there had been no justification for most of what had transpired. A routine call about suspicious activity had escalated into something that could easily become a public relations nightmare for the department. Meanwhile, Ray Wilson stood watching his career slip away with each passing minute. He had started the day as a 15-year veteran with a decent record. Now he was facing the prospect of disciplinary action, possible lawsuits, and the humiliation of having his mistakes broadcast on social media for the world to see. But the worst part was that deep down, he was beginning to realize that Steven Seagal and all those witnesses were right. He had let his assumptions and prejudices drive his actions, and an innocent girl had paid the price for his poor judgment. As news vans began pulling into the parking lot and reporters started setting up their cameras, Ray knew that this story was about to become much bigger than just a local incident, and he was going to be at the center of it all. As the crowd continued to grow and more news vans pulled into the parking lot, Steven Seagal pulled out his phone. The situation had clearly moved beyond a simple misunderstanding, and he knew he needed to handle this properly to protect both his daughter and ensure that justice was served. "Dad, what are you doing?" Harissa asked, noticing her father's serious expression as he scrolled through his contacts. "Making sure this doesn't happen to other kids," Stephen replied quietly, then looked up at Sergeant Peters. "Sergeant, I'm going to need the names and badge numbers of all the officers involved in this incident." Peters felt his stomach tighten. This was exactly what he'd been hoping to avoid. "Mr. Seagal, I understand you're upset, but perhaps we can handle this internally. Officer Wilson clearly made some errors in judgment today." "This goes beyond errors in judgment," Stephen said calmly. "What happened here today was a violation of my daughter's civil rights. She was targeted without cause, detained illegally, and threatened with physical force for exercising her constitutional rights." Ray Wilson, who had been standing silently for the past few minutes, suddenly exploded. "Constitutional rights? She's 16 years old. Kids don't have the same rights as adults." The crowd reacted with shocked murmurs and several people shouted disagreements. Even the other officers looked embarrassed by Ray's outburst. Stephen turned to face Ray directly. "Officer Wilson, you just demonstrated exactly why this incident needs to be formally investigated. Your fundamental misunderstanding of citizens' rights is part of the problem." While this exchange was happening, Arisa noticed that several people in the crowd were live streaming the entire confrontation on their phones. She tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered, "Dad, everyone's recording this." Stephen nodded. He was well aware of the cameras and had been careful to keep his tone measured and professional throughout the interaction. Years in the entertainment industry had taught him how to handle media attention, but more importantly, his law enforcement background had taught him the importance of documentation in cases like this. "Sergeant Peters," Stephen said, returning his attention to the supervising officer, "I'm going to call my attorney now. I want to make sure this incident is properly documented and investigated." Stephen dialed a number and waited for an answer. "David, it's Stephen. I need you to come to the Beverly Center immediately. There's been an incident involving Arissa and the Beverly Hills Police Department." The attorney's voice was faint but audible to those standing nearby. "Is she hurt?" "She's physically fine, but her rights were violated. I need you here to witness the rest of this interaction and to file a formal complaint." I'll be there in 15 minutes, came the reply. Meanwhile, Officer Martinez had been quietly observing the crowd and noticed that several reporters had arrived and were setting up cameras. He approached Sergeant Peters and spoke in a low voice. "Sarge, Channel 7 News is here and I just saw a CNN van pulling in. This is about to become a media circus." Peters looked around and saw that Martinez was right. The story was already spreading on social media, and now traditional news outlets were picking it up. He could imagine the headlines: Steven Seagal's daughter detained by police, or action star's teen daughter allegedly mistreated by cops. "Mr. Seagal," Peter said urgently, "perhaps we could continue this conversation at the station, away from all the cameras." Steven considered this for a moment. "Sergeant, I appreciate your concern about the media attention, but this conversation needs to happen here in public where the incident occurred. The community has a right to see how their police department handles situations like this." Ray Wilson was becoming increasingly agitated as he watched his career prospects diminish with each passing minute. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "I was doing my job. I responded to a legitimate call and investigated a suspicious person." "A suspicious person?" Steven asked, his voice remaining calm despite Ray's outburst. "What exactly was suspicious about a teenager sitting on a public bench drinking coffee?" Ray struggled to find an answer that would make sense to the crowd and cameras now recording his every word. "She was alone. She wasn't shopping. She was just sitting there, like thousands of people do every day in shopping centers across America," Steven replied. "Sergeant Peters, is it now Beverly Hills Police Department policy to detain people for sitting on benches?" Peters was caught between defending his officer and acknowledging that the detention had been inappropriate. "Mr. Seagal, every situation is different, and officers have to make judgment calls based on the information available to them." "And what information did Officer Wilson have that justified treating my daughter as a criminal suspect?" Steven asked. The question hung in the air as everyone waited for Peters to respond. The sergeant looked at Ray, hoping he might provide some additional context that would make the situation more defensible. But Ray just stared back at him with desperate eyes. At that moment, a well-dressed man in his 50s approached the group. "Mr. Seagal? I'm David Richardson, your attorney." Steven shook hands with the lawyer and quickly brought him up to speed on what had transpired. Richardson listened carefully, occasionally glancing at the officers and the crowd of onlookers. "Have formal charges been filed against your daughter?" Richardson asked. "No charges have been filed," Sergeant Peters replied quickly. "Has she been arrested?" "No, she has not been arrested." "Then on what legal basis was she detained and threatened with handcuffs?" Peters looked at Ray again, but the officers seemed to have run out of justifications. The legal reality of the situation was becoming clear to everyone present. Without probable cause of a crime, there had been no legal basis for detaining Arissa in the first place. Richardson turned to address the crowd of reporters who had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have witnessed here today is a clear example of racial profiling and abuse of police authority. A 16-year-old girl was targeted, detained, and threatened with physical force for the crime of sitting on a public bench while being a person of color. The reporters immediately began shouting questions at Richardson, Steven, and the police officers. The scene was becoming chaotic, with multiple cameras rolling and people trying to get closer to hear the responses. Officer Chen stepped forward and spoke quietly to Sergeant Peters. "Sarge, we need to get ahead of this story. If we don't handle this right, it's going to be a disaster for the department." Peters nodded grimly. He could already imagine the phone calls he would be receiving from the chief of police, the mayor, and probably the city council. This was exactly the kind of incident that departments across the country were desperately trying to avoid. But Ray Wilson wasn't ready to give up. "This is all being blown out of proportion," he shouted over the noise of the crowd. "I was investigating a legitimate complaint. I followed proper procedures." Steven turned to face Ray one more time. "Officer Wilson, you investigated a complaint by assuming a teenage girl was guilty of something based on nothing more than her appearance and age. You escalated a simple conversation into a detention. You threatened to handcuff a minor who had committed no crime and was fully cooperative. If those are your department's proper procedures, then your department has serious problems." Ray's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. He wanted to argue back, but he could see in the faces around him that he had already lost this battle. His fellow officers were looking at him with disappointment and disgust. The crowd was clearly on Stephen and Arissa's side, and the media was capturing every moment of his humiliation. As Richardson began explaining to the reporters what legal actions they planned to pursue, Ray Wilson realized that his 15-year career in law enforcement was effectively over. What had started as a routine call had become the worst day of his professional life, and it was all being broadcast for the world to see. But this was only the beginning. The real consequences of his actions were yet to come. The parking lot of the Beverly Center had transformed into something resembling a movie set. News trucks from every major network lined the perimeter, their satellite dishes extended toward the sky. Reporters jockeyed for position while camera crews set up equipment. What had started as a routine police call had become a major news story in less than 2 hours. Steven Seagal stood at the center of it all, his imposing presence commanding attention even among the chaos. At 6'4" with his distinctive ponytail and confident demeanor, he was instantly recognizable to the growing crowd. But this wasn't a movie premiere or publicity event. This was a father protecting his daughter's rights and dignity. Mr. Seagal. Mr. Seagal, reporters shouted from behind the police tape that had been hastily erected to create some space around the incident scene. Can you tell us what happened here today? Stephen held up his hand to quiet the crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the parking lot. My 16-year-old daughter was racially profiled and illegally detained by Officer Ray Wilson of the Beverly Hills Police Department. She committed no crime, violated no laws, and was fully cooperative throughout this ordeal. The reporters erupted with follow-up questions, but Stephen continued speaking over them. What happened here today represents everything that is wrong with policing in America. A teenager sitting peacefully on a public bench was treated like a criminal suspect because of her appearance and age. Ray Wilson stood about 20 feet away, surrounded by his fellow officers but looking completely isolated. The other cops were clearly distancing themselves from him, both physically and professionally. Even Sergeant Peters had positioned himself closer to Stephen than to his own subordinate officer. Officer Wilson, a reporter called out, "Do you have any response to these allegations?" Ray looked like a deer caught in headlights. His face was pale and sweat was visible on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. I was following department procedures," he stammered. "I responded to a citizen complaint and conducted a legitimate investigation." "What crime did you suspect Miss Seagal of committing?" Another reporter pressed. Ray's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. The call was about suspicious activity and possible shoplifting. But no evidence of shoplifting was found, correct? The reporter followed up. "Well, no, but..." "And Miss Seagal had a receipt showing she was a paying customer of the coffee shop." Ray didn't answer. He looked desperately at Sergeant Peters for support. But Peters was busy talking quietly with his attorney on his own phone, probably getting guidance on how to handle the media circus. Stephen's attorney, David Richardson, stepped forward to address the reporters. "We want to be clear about what happened here today. Arissa Seagal was approached by Officer Wilson while she was peacefully waiting for her father outside a business where she had made a legitimate purchase. She was questioned extensively, had her belongings searched, and was ultimately threatened with handcuffs and arrest despite committing no crime whatsoever." A reporter from CNN raised her hand. "Mr. Richardson, are you planning to file a lawsuit against the Beverly Hills Police Department?" "All legal options are being considered," Richardson replied. "What's most important right now is ensuring that Officer Wilson's conduct is thoroughly investigated and that steps are taken to prevent this from happening to other young people in the community." Officer Martinez, who had been quietly documenting the incident for the police report, approached Sergeant Peters. "Sarge, the chief is on his way down here. He wants to handle this personally." Peters nodded grimly. Chief Williams was a political appointment who prided himself on maintaining good community relations. An incident involving a celebrity's daughter being mistreated by one of his officers was his worst nightmare. Meanwhile, Arissa had been standing quietly beside her father throughout most of the media attention. She looked overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight but remained composed. When a reporter approached her directly, Stephen immediately stepped in. "My daughter will not be answering questions at this time," Stephen said firmly. "She's a minor who has been through a traumatic experience and her privacy needs to be respected." But Arissa touched her father's arm. "Dad, it's okay. I want to say something." Stephen looked at his daughter carefully, then nodded. "Keep it brief." Arissa stepped forward, and the crowd of reporters immediately focused their attention on her. Despite being only 16, she carried herself with remarkable poise given the circumstances. "I want people to know that I wasn't doing anything wrong today," Arissa said clearly. "I was sitting on a public bench drinking coffee and waiting for my dad. I answered every question the officer asked me. I let him search my bag. I showed him my ID. I was polite and respectful the entire time." Her voice gained strength as she continued. "But none of that mattered because Officer Wilson had already decided I was guilty of something. He didn't see a high school student waiting for her father. He saw whatever stereotype was in his head, and that's why we're all here right now." The parking lot was completely silent as Arissa spoke. Even the veteran reporters seemed moved by the teenager's composure and dignity in the face of such unfair treatment. "I hope that by sharing what happened to me today, other kids won't have to go through the same thing," Arissa concluded. "Everyone deserves to be treated with respect, regardless of their age or what they look like." The crowd erupted in applause, and several people called out words of support. Stephen put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, pride evident on his face despite the difficult circumstances. Chief Williams arrived at that moment, his official police vehicle cutting through the crowd of news trucks. He was a tall, thin man in his late 50s with graying hair and a perpetually worried expression that seemed even more pronounced today. As the chief approached the group, Ray Wilson felt his last hope slipping away. Chief Williams was known for throwing officers under the bus when they became political liabilities. Ray knew that his fate was probably already decided. "Mr. Seagal," Chief Williams said as he approached, "I'm Chief Robert Williams. I want to personally apologize for what happened to your daughter today." Stephen studied the chief's face carefully. "Chief Williams, I appreciate your apology, but apologies won't fix the systemic problems that led to this incident. Your officer violated my daughter's rights based on nothing more than racial bias and poor judgment." "You're absolutely right," Chief Williams said, surprising everyone with his directness. "What happened here today is unacceptable and does not represent the values of the Beverly Hills Police Department." Ray Wilson stared at his chief in disbelief. He had expected some level of institutional support, even if disciplinary action was warranted. But Chief Williams was essentially throwing him under the bus in front of the media. "Officer Wilson," Chief Williams called out, his voice carrying across the parking lot, "you're suspended from duty pending a full investigation into your conduct today." The announcement sent a ripple through the crowd of reporters, who immediately began firing questions at both the chief and Ray. But Ray barely heard them. 15 years of his life, his career, his reputation, it was all crashing down around him in real time, broadcast live for the world to see. As Chief Williams continued speaking to the media about accountability and reform, Steven Seagal looked around at the scene. This was bigger than just his daughter now. This had become a symbol of everything wrong with police-community relations in America, and he intended to make sure that some good came out of his daughter's traumatic experience. The suspension announcement sent shockwaves through the crowd. Ray Wilson stood frozen in place, the weight of Chief Williams's words hitting him like a physical blow. 15 years of service, countless commendations, a clean record until today. All of it seemed meaningless now as reporters thrust microphones in his direction and cameras captured his stunned expression. "Officer Wilson, how do you respond to your suspension?" a reporter from Fox News shouted. Ray looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to hide. His fellow officers had created distance between themselves and him, leaving him isolated in the center of the media storm. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Steven Seagal watched the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He had wanted accountability for what happened to his daughter, but seeing a man's career destroyed in real time brought him no joy. Still, he knew that sometimes dramatic action was necessary to create lasting change. "Chief Williams," Steven said, stepping forward, "while I appreciate the swift action regarding Officer Wilson, I hope this incident will lead to broader reforms within your department." Chief Williams nodded eagerly. "Absolutely, Mr. Seagal. We're committed to reviewing our training protocols and policies to ensure this never happens again." But Steven wasn't finished. Drawing on his experience as a reserve deputy sheriff in Louisiana and his years working with law enforcement, he began systematically outlining the procedural violations that had occurred. Chief, your officer initiated contact with my daughter without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. The original call was about suspicious behavior, but sitting on a public bench with a coffee receipt hardly qualifies as suspicious. The gathered reporters furiously scribbled notes as Stephen continued his detailed breakdown of the incident. Officer Wilson then escalated to a detention without probable cause. My daughter was cooperative, provided identification, and consented to a search of her belongings. At no point did she give him legal justification to detain her. Chief Williams looked increasingly uncomfortable as Stephen's analysis continued. It was clear that the action star had substantial knowledge of police procedures and constitutional law. Furthermore, Stephen continued, when my daughter used defensive techniques to avoid being improperly handcuffed, Officer Wilson characterized this as resisting arrest. But you cannot resist an arrest that has no legal basis to begin with. Attorney David Richardson stepped forward to support Stephen's analysis. Chief Williams, what Mr. Seagal has just described represents multiple violations of my client's Fourth Amendment rights. This wasn't just poor judgment. It was a systematic violation of established constitutional protections. Ray Wilson finally found his voice. I was following my training, he shouted over the crowd noise. I've been doing this job for 15 years and I know how to handle suspicious persons. Stephen turned to face Ray directly. Officer Wilson, that's exactly the problem. You've been doing this job for 15 years and in all that time, you've apparently never learned the difference between suspicious behavior and existing while young and minority. The crowd reacted with murmurs of agreement, and several people applauded Stephen's words. Ray's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. That's not fair, Ray protested. I don't see color when I do my job. Then explain to me, Stephen said calmly. What made my daughter suspicious other than her age and appearance? Ray struggled to find an answer that would sound reasonable to the cameras recording his every word. She was alone, not shopping, just sitting there on her phone. Like millions of teenagers do every day in shopping centers across America, Stephen replied. Like your own children probably do. The only difference is that when your children sit on benches in shopping centers, officers like you don't approach them with suspicion. Officer Chen, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, stepped forward. Mr. Seagal is right, Chief. I've reviewed the incident report, and there was no justification for the initial contact, much less the attempted detention. Her words carried additional weight because she was speaking as a fellow officer. Chief Williams looked at Chen with surprise. Officers rarely criticized their colleagues publicly, especially in front of the media. Officer Chen, Chief Williams said sharply, this isn't the time or place for internal discussions. But Chen held her ground. With respect, Chief, this is exactly the time and place. The community deserves to know that not all officers support what happened here today. The crowd erupted in applause for Chen's courage in speaking out. Several reporters immediately began asking her questions about police culture and the willingness of officers to hold their colleagues accountable. Meanwhile, Ray Wilson watched his world collapse around him. Not only was he suspended and facing possible criminal charges, but now his fellow officers were publicly distancing themselves from his actions. The thin blue line that he had counted on for protection throughout his career had completely abandoned him. Officer Wilson, a reporter called out, do you plan to appeal your suspension? Ray looked around at the hostile crowd and the cameras broadcasting his humiliation to millions of viewers. I need to speak with my union representative, he said weakly. The police union has already issued a statement, announced a reporter who had been checking her phone. They say they will not defend officers who violate citizens' constitutional rights and bring dishonor to the profession. Ray staggered slightly as if he had been physically struck. Even his union was throwing him under the bus. He was completely alone now, facing the consequences of his actions without any institutional support. Stephen Seagal observed Ray's reaction and felt a moment of pity for the man. Officer Wilson, he said, his voice taking on a slightly gentler tone, I hope you'll use this experience to reflect on how your biases affected your judgment today. My daughter isn't your enemy. The community isn't your enemy. But when you treat innocent people like criminals, you create the very conflicts you're supposed to prevent. Ray looked at Stephen with desperate eyes. Mr. Seagal, I was just doing what I thought was right. I believe that, Stephen replied. But that's exactly the problem. In your mind, treating a 16-year-old girl like a criminal suspect seemed right. That's what needs to change. Chief Williams stepped forward, clearly eager to end the confrontation before any more damage was done to the department's reputation. Mr. Seagal, I want to assure you that Officer Wilson's actions today do not represent the values or training of the Beverly Hills Police Department. Then prove it, Stephen replied. Don't just suspend one officer and hope this goes away. Use this incident as a catalyst for real reform. Review your training programs, examine your policies on youth interactions, and create accountability mechanisms that prevent this from happening again. The chief nodded enthusiastically, but Stephen could see in his eyes that Williams was mainly focused on damage control rather than genuine reform. Still, the media attention and public pressure would force some level of meaningful action. As the crowd began to disperse and news crews started packing up their equipment, Arissa approached her father. Dad, I'm proud of how you handled this, but I also feel bad for Officer Wilson. He looked so lost. Stephen looked at his daughter with admiration. Even after being mistreated and humiliated, she could still feel compassion for the person who had wronged her. That level of maturity and empathy at 16 years old gave him hope for the future. That's what makes you special, Arissa, he said, putting his arm around her shoulders. You understand that people can do wrong things without being fundamentally evil. Officer Wilson made terrible choices today, but maybe losing his career will help him become a better person. As they walked toward their SUV, Stephen knew that this incident would follow them for years to come. But he also knew that his daughter had shown tremendous courage and dignity under pressure, and that their actions today might help prevent other families from going through similar experiences. The reckoning was far from over, but justice was finally beginning to be served. 3 months after the incident at Beverly Center, the hashtag Justice for Arissa had been used over 2 million times on social media. The video footage of the confrontation had been viewed by tens of millions of people worldwide, sparking conversations about police reform, racial profiling, and the treatment of young people by law enforcement. Steven Seagal sat in his home office, reviewing the latest updates from his attorney. The civil rights investigation by the FBI had concluded that Officer Ray Wilson had indeed violated Arissa's constitutional rights. The Justice Department was preparing to file federal charges, and the civil lawsuit against the Beverly Hills Police Department was moving forward. But for Stephen, the legal proceedings were only part of the story. What mattered more was the change that was beginning to happen as a result of his daughter's courage in speaking out. Dad, Arissa said, knocking on his office door. The reporter from 60 Minutes is here for the follow-up interview. Stephen looked up from his paperwork. Are you ready for this? Arissa nodded. Over the past 3 months, she had found her voice as an advocate for youth rights and police reform. What had started as a traumatic experience had transformed into a platform for positive change. They walked into the living room where correspondent Anderson Cooper was setting up for the interview. The veteran journalist had been following the story since the beginning and was preparing a comprehensive report on the incident's aftermath. Mr. Seagal, Arissa, Cooper said warmly, thank you for agreeing to this follow-up interview. I know the past few months have been challenging for your family. It's been difficult but also inspiring, Stephen replied. We've seen how one incident can spark a national conversation about important issues. Cooper turned to Arissa. You've become something of an activist since the incident. Tell me about that transformation. Arissa sat up straight, her confidence evident. I realized that staying quiet wasn't going to help other kids who might go through what I experienced. If I have a platform to speak about these issues, I need to use it responsibly. And what changes have you seen since the incident went viral? Stephen answered this question. The Beverly Hills Police Department has implemented new training protocols specifically focused on interactions with minors. They've created a youth advisory board that Arissa serves on, and they've established an independent oversight committee to review complaints about officer conduct. Cooper nodded. What about Officer Wilson? What happened to him? The question hung in the air for a moment. Ray Wilson's story had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked bias and poor judgment. Officer Wilson was terminated from the Beverly Hills Police Department, Stephen said. He's facing federal civil rights charges and is currently unemployed. His police certification has been revoked, so he can't work in law enforcement anywhere in California. Do you feel justice has been served? Cooper asked. Arissa looked thoughtful. I feel like accountability has been served, which is important. But I also hope that Officer Wilson learns from this experience and becomes a better person. Destroying his life completely doesn't help anyone. Stephen smiled at his daughter's response. Even after everything she had been through, she maintained her compassion and desire to see people grow and change. Cooper shifted to a broader perspective. The incident has sparked policy changes beyond Beverly Hills. Can you tell me about that? 7 states have passed new laws requiring additional training for police officers who interact with minors, Stephen explained. The Arissa protocols, as they're being called, mandate specific procedures for questioning young people and require parental notification in most cases. And the impact has gone international, Arissa added. I've spoken with youth advocates in Canada, the UK, and Australia about implementing similar protections for young people. Cooper leaned forward. You've both become prominent voices in the police reform movement. Was that something you intended? Not at all, Stephen replied. We just wanted to make sure that what happened to Arissa didn't happen to other kids. But once we started speaking out, we realized how many families had similar stories. We felt obligated to keep pushing for change. The interview continued for another hour, covering the family's work with civil rights organizations, their advocacy for police reform, and their efforts to bridge the divide between law enforcement and communities of color. Later that evening, Stephen and Arissa sat on their back patio, watching the sunset over Beverly Hills. The same shopping center where the incident occurred was visible in the distance, now serving as a reminder of how much their lives had changed. Dad? Arissa said quietly. Do you think we've made a difference? Stephen considered the question carefully. I think we've started conversations that needed to happen. Real change takes time, but I believe we've planted seeds that will grow into something meaningful. Arissa pulled out her phone and showed him a message she had received that morning. This is from a 15-year-old girl in Atlanta. She said that after seeing our story, she had the courage to report an officer who was harassing kids at her school. The officer is now being investigated. Stephen read the message and felt a surge of pride. That's exactly why we keep doing this work. Every young person who feels empowered to stand up for their rights makes this worthwhile. Meanwhile, across town, Ray Wilson sat in a small apartment, reading the same news coverage of Stephen and Arissa's continued advocacy work. His life had been completely upended by the incident 3 months ago. He had lost his career, his reputation, and most of his friends in law enforcement. But in quiet moments like this, Ray was beginning to understand what Stephen Seagal had tried to tell him that day. He had let his prejudices and assumptions guide his actions, and an innocent girl had paid the price for his failure as a police officer. Ray had started seeing a therapist to work through his biases and anger issues. He was also volunteering at a community center in a predominantly minority neighborhood, trying to rebuild his understanding of the communities he had sworn to serve and protect. It would be a long road to redemption, if redemption was even possible. But for the first time since the incident, Ray was beginning to see how his actions had been wrong, and he was committed to becoming a better person. Back at the Seagal home, Stephen's phone buzzed with a text from his attorney. The civil lawsuit had been settled for a substantial amount that would fund youth advocacy programs for the next decade. More importantly, the Beverly Hills Police Department had agreed to implement comprehensive reforms that would serve as a model for other departments across the country. It's not perfect, Stephen said to Arissa as he shared the news, but it's progress, and progress is what creates lasting change. Arissa smiled and hugged her father. Thanks for teaching me that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's difficult. As the sun set over Los Angeles, father and daughter sat together in comfortable silence, knowing that their fight for justice had made a difference. The incident that had started as one officer's poor judgment had become a catalyst for meaningful reform. And most importantly, other young people across the country would be safer because Arissa had found the courage to speak out about what happened to her that day at Beverly Center. The legacy of justice for Arissa would live on in the policies, training programs, and cultural changes that emerged from their advocacy. Sometimes justice comes not just from punishment, but from the determination to ensure that others don't have to endure the same injustice. In that sense, Stephen and Arissa Seagal had achieved something more valuable than any legal victory. They had created lasting change that would protect future generations.